My grandmother's hands were resting on the hospital blanket, folded the way she used to fold them in church, and she looked at me. Not at the ceiling, not at the machines beeping beside her bed, but straight at me, and she said, "I'm not afraid of what you think I'm afraid of." Then she smiled, closed her eyes, and never explained what she meant. I sat there for hours turning that sentence over in my mind, and it took me years of watching other elders near the end of their lives, before I finally understood what she was trying to tell me. Because here's the truth almost no one says out loud. The wisest people alive right now, the ones who have lived the longest and buried the most people they loved, are not afraid of death the way you think they are. What they're afraid of is something else entirely. And once you understand what that is, it will change the way you spend every day you have left. It changed the way I've spent every day since. In the next half hour, I want to walk with you through 8 truths that wise elders come to understand about death. Not clinical truths, not religious doctrine, but the quiet, hard-won wisdom that only shows up after decades of loss, love, and looking mortality straight in the eye. I've gathered these from years of listening to people in their 80s and 90s talk honestly, when no one was rushing them, about what they'd finally figured out. These are not depressing truths. They are the opposite. Each one is something that, once you really absorb it, makes the life you have right now feel more urgent, more tender, and more worth living. By the end, you'll understand exactly what my grandmother meant that day, and maybe you'll find you already knew it too. So let's start at the beginning with reason number 1, because it's the truth that changes everything else that follows. Think about how many times you've said, "Someday. Someday I'll take that trip. Someday I'll call her and really talk, not just check in. Someday I'll write the letter, take the photo, say the thing that's been sitting in your chest for 20 years. You've said it. Almost everyone has. Here's what wise elders come to understand, often only after they've lost someone or faced their own mortality up close. Someday is not a real place on the calendar. It's a comforting story the mind tells itself so it doesn't have to feel the weight of limited time. Psychologists who study aging have a name for what shifts here. It isn't that older adults become more pessimistic about the future, it's that their sense of time horizon narrows, and that narrowing paradoxically sharpens what actually matters instead of dulling it. When you're young, or even in what feels like the safety of middle age, death is an abstraction, something that happens to other people in other decades, in some future you don't have to think about yet. That distance gives you permission to wait. But elders who have truly reckoned with their own mortality lose that distance. They watch the calendar stop feeling infinite and start feeling like a specific, countable number, even if no one knows exactly what that number is. And something remarkable happens in that moment. Joy that was always being postponed suddenly refuses to wait any longer. The trip gets booked. The call gets made. The letter gets written, not because there's a deadline stamped on it, but because the elder has finally stopped pretending there's always more time coming. This isn't about being reckless or throwing caution to the wind. It's about recognizing that the version of your life you keep promising yourself for later is only ever lived in the present tense, and later has an unfortunate habit of never actually arriving for the people who wait for it. Ask any elder about the trip they almost didn't take or the reunion they almost skipped, and you'll usually hear the same shape of story. Someone kept saying next year until a diagnosis or a fall or simply the quiet erosion of energy made next year impossible. And what strikes them, looking back, isn't regret about the trip itself. It's the realization that they had been treating their own life like a reservation that could always be rescheduled, when in fact it was closer to a train that only stops at the station once. Wise elders describe a shift in how time itself feels once this sinks in. Years stop feeling like an endless hallway and start feeling like a hallway with a door somewhere ahead. A door whose exact location no one can see but whose existence can no longer be denied. That shift is uncomfortable at first. But it's also the thing that finally gets people off the couch, onto the plane, back on the phone with the person they've been meaning to call for a decade. It's worth noticing that this isn't despair talking. Despair would say none of it matters anymore. What wise elders describe is closer to urgency wrapped in gratitude. A sense that because the hallway has an end, every step taken inside it deserves to be walked with open eyes instead of half asleep. Wise elders don't rush toward death by thinking about it. Thinking about death is what finally makes life feel real, urgent, and worth showing up for today, not in some imagined future that may or may not exist. That's not morbid. That's clarity. And once that clarity settles in, once someday stops meaning anything to you, you start noticing something else, something a little harder to admit out loud. So the first thing wise elders know is this: waiting for someday is how you lose the only day you actually have, which is today. And once that truth settles into your bones, it makes you look differently at everyone you've ever been angry at. Which brings us to reason number 2, the one almost no one wants to admit. Who are you still angry at? Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but quietly underneath, in a place you don't visit very often. A sibling who said something unforgivable at a funeral. A friend who chose someone else over you. A parent who never once said, "I'm proud of you," even when you know somewhere they probably were. It's easy to assume forgiveness has to feel like a warm reconciliation scene, the kind you see in movies with tears and open arms. Wise elders will tell you something quieter and more surprising. It rarely looks like that in real life, and it doesn't need to. Wise elders will tell you something that surprises most people. Forgiveness, in the end, was never really about the other person. It was never about deciding they deserved it, or that what they did was suddenly okay. It was about something much more selfish, in the best possible sense of that word. Carrying a grudge is a kind of slow dying while you're still alive. A tax paid daily on your own peace, collected by someone who, in many cases, isn't even thinking about you anymore. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from rehearsing an old argument in your head for the 1000th time, refining the comeback you never got to deliver, replaying the injustice as if replaying it might somehow change the outcome. Elders who have watched their own remaining time shrink stop being willing to pay that tax. They start asking a different question than, do they deserve my forgiveness? They start asking, how much longer am I willing to let this cost me? And that question changes everything, because it puts the power back where it always should have been, in their own hands, not in the hands of whoever hurt them. This doesn't mean every relationship gets repaired. Some bridges stay burned, and that's all right too. What changes is internal, not external. The anger stops being carried around like a stone in the pocket, present in every quiet moment, weighing down every reflection. Think about the families you know where 2 siblings haven't spoken in 15 years over something that, if you asked either of them today, they'd struggle to explain in full. That's what an old grudge does over time. It stops being about the original event and starts being about the identity built around never forgiving. Wise elders who have watched their own siblings, spouses, or old friends die before the grudge ever got resolved describe a very specific kind of grief, one layered with something close to anger at themselves, not for having been hurt, but for having spent years guarding a wound instead of tending to it. This is why so many elders make a phone call late in life that surprises everyone around them, reaching out to someone they haven't spoken to in decades, not necessarily to reconcile fully, but simply to set the weight down before it becomes permanent. Letting go doesn't mean the wound never happened. It means the wound no longer gets to write the next chapter. Wise elders learn, often later than they wish they had, that resentment is a room you can leave at any time. The door was never actually locked. That's not weakness. That's wisdom choosing peace over being right. And once you've set that weight down, you start to notice how much you've been holding back from the people you love most, which is where we're headed next. Stay with me, because reason number 3 asks something of nearly everyone listening, whether you realize it yet or not. Picture this. You're on the phone with someone you love, wrapping up the call the way you always do. Okay. Talk soon. Love you, bye. Said so fast, so automatically, that the words barely register anymore. Now imagine that was the last conversation you'd ever have with them. Would those words feel like enough? Wise elders, especially the ones who've sat beside a hospital bed and realized there wasn't time left to say what needed saying, stop treating "I love you" as something implied. Younger people often assume love is understood, that actions speak for themselves, that saying the words out loud is somehow unnecessary, even a little embarrassing. It's a quiet kind of math everyone does without realizing it. Surely they know, surely it's obvious, surely there will be another chance to say it more clearly later. But elders who have lost people suddenly, without warning, without a final conversation, learn a harder lesson. The people you love cannot read your mind. An assumption is a gamble you don't always win. So they start saying it out loud, not as a throwaway phrase tacked onto the end of a phone call, but as something they mean, something they pause on. They tell their children they're proud of them, specifically, not vaguely. They tell old friends what that friendship actually meant, not just that it was nice. There's a particular kind of regret that shows up in hospital rooms and at gravesides, and it almost never sounds like, "I wish I'd done more." It sounds like, "I wish I'd said it." This is especially true for elders who grew up in households where affection was shown through action rather than words. A plate of food made without being asked, a car fixed before anyone noticed it was broken, a bill quietly paid. That generation was often taught, implicitly, that saying "I love you" out loud was somehow soft, unnecessary, even a little indulgent. Something reserved for weddings and funerals, not ordinary Tuesday phone calls. But the ones who live longest, who sit with the most loss, tend to unlearn that lesson eventually. They start ending phone calls differently. They start writing it in birthday cards instead of just signing their name. Some even go back and say it to people they raised decades ago. Watching a grown son or daughter's face change completely at hearing words they'd waited their whole life to hear spoken plainly. Wise elders decide, somewhere along the way, that they would rather feel a little exposed saying the words too often than silent and safe, having never said them at all. Love that stays unspoken doesn't disappear, but it also doesn't do the work love is supposed to do. It doesn't land in the other person's heart the way it needs to. That's not oversharing. That's love finally being brave enough to speak. And once you start speaking your love out loud, something else starts to loosen too. The grip other people's opinions have had on you your entire life. There's a version of you that spent years performing, dressing a certain way, choosing a certain career, staying quiet in rooms where you should have spoken up, all because you were managing what other people might think. Wise elders describe a specific, almost physical sensation that arrives later in life. The audience simply stops mattering. Not because they stopped caring about people, elders are often more compassionate, not less, but because the specific fear of judgment, the anxious performance of being acceptable, starts to feel absurd next to the fact of limited time. Think about how much energy goes into managing other people's perceptions of you. The outfit chosen to avoid comment. The opinion swallowed to avoid conflict. The dream quietly abandoned because someone once called it impractical. Multiply that by every day of every year, and you start to see just how much of a life can quietly disappear into an audience that was never actually watching that closely to begin with. Elders who have made peace with mortality look back at decades of that performance and feel something close to grief for the time it consumed, and that grief becomes fuel for change. It's a strange kind of mourning, grieving years that were technically lived but never quite inhabited, spent instead rehearsing a version of yourself designed for other people's comfort. They stop asking "what will people think?" and start asking "what actually matters to me in the time I have?" This is why so many older adults suddenly take up painting, or move across the country, or wear the loud colors they always secretly loved, or finally say no to obligations that never brought them anything but exhaustion. It isn't a midlife crisis. It's the opposite. It's clarity arriving late, but arriving completely. Compare that to a life spent chasing approval that was never guaranteed to arrive in the first place. The promotion taken to impress a parent who's no longer around to notice, the wedding planned around what the extended family would think rather than what the couple actually wanted, the decades spent editing yourself down into someone easier for other people to accept. Wise elders often describe looking back at that version of themselves with a kind of tenderness rather than shame, the way you might look at a child who didn't know any better yet. And then, almost universally, they describe the same feeling once the performing stops. Lightness. Not recklessness, not selfishness, but the specific relief of no longer managing an audience that, in most cases, was barely paying attention in the first place. The opinions of strangers, and even of some family members, lose their grip once you understand how few days are actually left to spend earning approval that was never guaranteed to come anyway. That's not giving up. That's finally being free. If you're still here, this next part matters even more, because it's the one most people don't understand until it's almost too late to use it. Think about an ordinary Tuesday. Coffee brewing. Sunlight coming through the kitchen window at a particular slant. Someone you love, sitting across the table half paying attention to their phone. Nothing special happens. It's just a day. Wise elders will tell you, if you ask them honestly, that these are the moments they miss most, not the big ones. Not the weddings, not the milestone birthdays, not the vacations photographed and framed. The ordinary Tuesdays. the unremarkable phone calls, the sound of someone moving around in another room, alive, present, simply there. When you're young, meaning gets attached almost exclusively to the extraordinary, the achievement, the celebration, the thing worth posting about, the day dressed up enough to be worth remembering on purpose. But elders who have lost people learn, often painfully, that it was never the extraordinary days they were grieving. It was the ordinary ones, the ones that quietly stopped happening. This realization does something profound to how a person experiences time. Once you understand that an unremarkable afternoon with someone you love is not a placeholder before the real moments, that it is, in fact, one of the real moments, you start paying attention differently. The sound of your spouse humming in the next room, the particular way your father cleared his throat before saying something important, the weight of a grandchild's hand in yours during a walk that goes nowhere in particular. There's a reason so many widowed elders say the hardest part isn't the funeral, or even the first holiday alone. It's the small stuff. Reaching for 2 coffee mugs out of habit before remembering there's only one person to pour for now. The silence where a particular laugh used to be. That specific, aching absence is what teaches wise elders. Often too late for the person they lost, but not too late for the people still around them. That ordinary togetherness was never a placeholder for something more important later. It was the important thing the entire time, hiding in plain sight because it never announced itself. Wise elders don't treat these things as small. They treat them as sacred because they've learned the hard way that sacred was never about scale. It was about attention. That's not sentimental. That's seeing clearly, maybe for the first time. And once ordinary moments start to feel sacred, something else becomes easier to face. The parts of your life that never got finished at all. There's a project in a drawer somewhere. A dream that got quietly shelved. A version of your life you once imagined that never came to be. The book unwritten, the trip untaken, the relationship that ended before it became what it could have been. Wise elders, especially those in their final years, are often asked some version of the same question. Does it haunt you, the things you never finished? And the honest answer, from most of them, is more peaceful than you'd expect. Somewhere along the way, they stop measuring a life by its completion and start measuring it by its depth. It's a shift from thinking of life as a project with a final deliverable to thinking of it as a practice, something lived in the doing rather than judged by the finished result. A life is not a checklist, and it was never supposed to be one, though almost everyone spends their younger years treating it exactly that way, crossing off milestones as though the crossing off were the point. The unfinished novel doesn't erase the years of joy that came from writing it. The relationship that ended doesn't erase the love that was real while it lasted. Wise elders come to understand that closure is a beautiful idea and a rare reality. Most lives end mid-sentence, mid-project, mid-relationship, mid-dream, and that isn't failure. That's simply what it means to be a person who kept growing until the very end, rather than one who stopped reaching for anything new the moment life felt safe and settled. Think of the garden someone spent 30 years shaping, knowing full well they'd never see the oldest trees reach their full height. Or the language half learned, the instrument picked up at 65 with no illusions about becoming a virtuoso, simply because the learning itself felt like being alive. Younger people sometimes look at these pursuits and ask, gently or not so gently, what's the point, if there isn't time left to master it? Wise elders find that question almost beside the point. The garden was never about seeing the final tree. The language was never about fluency. The point all along was the reaching itself, the daily decision to keep growing rather than settle into a life that had already decided it was finished simply because the years were running short. There's a quiet dignity in someone who keeps starting things at 80, who signs up for a class or plants a tree they may never see mature, simply because the starting was never dependent on the finishing. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from accepting an unfinished life rather than mourning it. The peace of understanding that meaning was never in the finishing. It was in the reaching. That's not failure. That's peace, and peace is its own kind of finishing. Stay with me a little longer because what comes next is the part of this video I've been building toward the whole time. There's a reason that line lands differently once you've lived long enough to bury people you loved. It stops being a motivational poster and starts being a description of how it actually feels to hold both truths at once, the shortness of time and the endlessness of curiosity, without letting either one cancel the other out. Silence is the strangest part of how most families handle death. Everyone knows it's coming, eventually, for everyone in the room, and almost no one says a word about it. Wise elders, more often than younger people expect, want to talk about it. Not morbidly, not to frighten anyone, but honestly, where they want to be buried or scattered, what they hope their last days look like, what they're proud of, what they're still afraid of. For many of them, it's less about the practical details and more about being allowed, one last time, to be fully known by the people around them. And yet families frequently shut this down, changing the subject, insisting don't talk like that. As though silence were somehow protective, as though refusing to say a word could quietly hold death at bay a little longer. Elders who have made peace with their own mortality often find this silence lonelier than death itself. Because what they're really trying to do, in bringing it up, is love their family one last important way, by making sure nothing is left unclear, unsaid, or guessed at later during grief, when clarity is hardest to find. Consider the families who never had that conversation, and what happens afterward, siblings arguing over what their mother would have wanted, each one certain, each one guessing, because the subject was always changed the moment it came up. Compare that to the families who did sit down and talk about it, awkwardly at first, maybe over a kitchen table, maybe during a long car ride, and who later described that conversation as one of the most loving things they ever shared, precisely because it was hard. The discomfort, it turns out, was never a sign they were doing something wrong. It was a sign they were finally doing something honest. Talking about death openly is not giving up on life. It is, in a strange and tender way, one of the last acts of care an elder can offer the people they love, sparing them confusion, sparing them the guilt of wondering what their loved one would have wanted. Wise elders learn that avoiding the subject doesn't protect anyone from the eventual loss. It only ensures that when the loss comes, it arrives without preparation, without the comfort of having already said everything that mattered. That's not giving up. That's love, refusing to stay silent. And that willingness to talk openly leads to the final truth, the one that ties everything else together. What do you actually want to leave behind? Not in the way that question usually gets asked, not about money or property or who gets what. Wise elders, when they think honestly about legacy, almost never mention their achievements first. They mention a recipe someone still makes on Sundays, a saying they used to repeat that a grandchild now says without realizing where it came from. A particular way of listening, of showing up, of loving someone fully, that got passed down without anyone ever writing it in a will. This is the quiet, radical truth wise elders come to understand. You don't get remembered for what you accumulated. You get remembered for what you gave away. Attention, patience, forgiveness, love, said out loud, ordinary Tuesdays paid attention to instead of rushed through. It's a strange kind of math, where the things given away multiply instead of shrink, passed from one generation into the next without ever running out. Think about the phrases your own grandparents used to say, the ones that still slip out of your mouth sometimes without warning, in exactly their tone, over exactly the same situations. Think about the dish nobody can quite replicate the same way, though everyone keeps trying every holiday because trying is itself a form of remembering. None of that required fame. None of it required leaving behind wealth or achievements or a name anyone outside the family would recognize. Legacy was never about being unforgettable to the whole world. It was about becoming a permanent, gentle presence inside the people who loved you, showing up in the way they raise their own children, the way they handle their own grief, the way they choose one day to say, I love you out loud instead of assuming it's understood. Wise elders stop fearing being forgotten by history because they understand something history can't measure. They were never trying to live in history. They were trying to live inside the people they loved, and in that sense, nothing about them ever really has to end. A name might fade off a headstone eventually. A gesture, repeated for generations without anyone remembering where it started, does not. That's not disappearing. That's becoming part of everyone you loved. So let's go back to my grandmother and that sentence she never explained. I'm not afraid of what you think I'm afraid of. I understand it now. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid, all those years, of dying with the words unsaid. The grudges still carried. The ordinary Tuesdays rushed past without notice. The life measured by a checklist instead of by depth. And by the time she said that sentence to me, she had already made her peace with every one of those fears. She had said what needed saying, forgiven what needed forgiving, and paid attention to more ordinary Tuesdays than most of us ever will. That's what she was telling me without quite telling me. that the fear was never death itself. It was the fear of an unlived life, and she had already, quietly, put that fear to rest. If any part of what you just heard settled into your chest a little, a name you should call, a sentence you should finally say, an ordinary Tuesday you should stop rushing through, let that be the thing you do today, not someday. That's really the only message underneath all 8 of these truths. Not one of them asked you to be afraid of dying. Every one of them asked you to be a little more awake while you're living. And if this kind of reflection means something to you, if you'd like more of these conversations about what it really means to live wisely, to age with grace, to face the years ahead with a little more peace than fear, consider staying with us here. This channel exists for exactly this, for the quiet truths that don't get said enough, for the wisdom that usually only gets passed down in hospital rooms and kitchen tables, spoken here instead, out loud, for anyone willing to listen. Subscribe if you'd like to keep sitting with these ideas together, one video at a time. Not because this channel needs the number, but because I have a feeling there are more sentences like my grandmother's waiting to finally make sense to you too. Thank you.